My name is Ben Burgis. I'm the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, out now from Zer0 Books, and one of four co-authors, along with Marion Trejo, Matt McManus, and Conrad Hamilton, of a book that's coming out in a couple weeks called Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson, with an introduction by Slavoj Žižek. But not going to talk about that today. Instead, I want to talk about the Bernie Sanders campaign, which of course formally ended this last week. In particular, I want to talk about a certain kind of reaction to it that I've seen a lot on left Twitter, and to kind of build up to what's wrong with that reaction, I want to talk about a few things that might seem not to have anything to do with this. Those things are Christopher Hitchens' 2002 feud with his friend Martin Amos, the Russian Revolution, and Modal Logic. Let's start with Hitchens and Amos. Christopher Hitchens, of course, was a leftist and a critic of U.S. imperialism up until the September 11th terrorist attacks, at which point he did a 180. The difference between the sort of things that he'd written in the first Gulf War, when he was talking about U.S. war crimes, when he was denouncing those who called for a peaceful negotiated compromise instead of bombing Iraq. People who said that was appeasement, he said that was like morally feckless and ridiculous, and he mocked that reaction. If you compare that to the sort of things that he was writing later, post 9/11, when he was an enthusiastic backer of first the war in Afghanistan and then the invasion of Iraq, which he referred to as the liberation of Iraq, and he retconned his position on the first Gulf War, which he now referred to as the liberation of Kuwait. And this was really such an extreme turnaround that his former friend, Tariq Ali, been a friend and comrade of Hitchens for decades, in his book Bush and Babylon, The Recolonization of Iraq, Tariq Ali has a wonderful appendix called Christopher Hitchens, where he says, I had this friend Christopher, who's this wonderful radical journalist, but unfortunately, like so many people, he died on 9/11, and in Christopher's case, he was replaced by this ridiculous neocon facsimile, which is funny, and it's a very savage critique. But of course, Hitchens' actual evolution is more complicated than that, because even though he did turn on a dime in many ways on the U.S. imperialism question after 9/11, he still had a lot of his old beliefs kind of rattling around in his head, and to the extent that when another old friend of his, the British novelist Martin Amos, who's a very fine novelist, but tends to write some very silly things about politics, came out with a book about Stalin entitled Koba the Dread, which was basically, oh my God, did you know Stalin was bad? Why is nobody talking about this? Hitchens wrote a very funny and very insightful review trashing the book, not because Hitchens was a fan of Stalin, of course, but because he was not a fan of the way his friend Martin had talked about the whole history leading up to Stalin in this really simplistic way, where he equated any sort of, Bolshevism or communism with Stalinism, and he equated Stalinism with Nazism. And this much Hitchens couldn't stand for. So Hitchens trashed the book in a review, and then Amos wrote an open letter to him, and Hitchens wrote an open letter back. And the open letter back is fantastic. It's entitled Don't Be Silly. Don't, period, be, period, silly, period. I'll just read real quick the passage where the title comes from. He says, Bolshevism was the only revolution that ever defeated its enemies, And when talking about various, leftists who were sympathetic to the revolution, he says there was an element of power worship here. I'm prepared to concede, and those involved, including myself, are obliged to subject themselves to self-criticism. But your attempted syllogism invites a direct comparison with Hitlerism and levels the suggestion of moral equivalence to the Nazis, to say the many hard left types who worked for Martin Luther King, right? The many, people associated with the communist movement who played heroic roles in the civil rights movement. My provisional critique of this ahistorical reasoning would fit into 3 short italicized sentences. Don't be silly, which I think is exactly the right response. But the part of this exchange that's the most on topic for the moment has to do with his response to Amos's open letter in response to his review. He talks about some of the differences between Stalinism and Nazism, and he says this. To this, one might add that Germany was a literate, democratic, and advanced civilization before the Nazis got to it, whereas Russia at the time of the 1905 revolution, remember that was the unsuccessful revolution that's sometimes referred to as a dress rehearsal for the successful revolution in 1917, was the condition more like that of Turkey or Iran or even in some areas Afghanistan today. And he goes on to speculate about what would have happened. He says, for example, if the civil war following the 1917 revolution had gone the other way, this is a common line. I think he's getting it from Victor Serge, that the word for fascism that we all use might have come not from Italian, but from Russian. And he goes on to give some very relevant distinctions between Bolshevism and Nazism. He says, does anyone believe that had the 1905 revolution succeeded, it would have led straight to the Gulag and to forced collectivization? Obviously not. Such a revolution might have even forestalled the Balkan Wars and World War I. Yet that revolution's moving spirits were Lenin and Trotsky, defeated by the forces of autocracy, orthodoxy, and militarism. Excuse me, but nobody can be bothered to argue much about whether fascism might have turned out better given more propitious circumstances. And there were no dissidents in the Nazi Party, risking their lives on the proposition that the Fuhrer had betrayed the true essence of National Socialism. As Amos himself half recognizes, the question just doesn't come up. All right, so he's pointed to 2 relevant disanalogies between Bolshevism, which became Stalinism, on the one hand, even in its late Stalinist phase, and Nazism. So the more obvious one is that the one that sort of calls to mind Victor Serge's classic line where he says that the germs of Stalinism were in Bolshevism all along, but there were massive other germs as well. So Hitchens is pointing to the fact that there were various oppositions, most famously Leon Trotsky and the left opposition, but not just that. There's also Bukharin and what's, I think, sometimes very misleadingly called the right opposition. There's the workers' opposition with Alexander Kolante a few years before Trotsky went into opposition. So there were all these opposition movements within the Bolshevik Party that did think that the drift of the Soviet Union was in the wrong direction, and they were trying to fight for a better form of socialism, whereas it's hard to even say the phrase a better form of Nazism with a straight face. Okay, that one's obvious. The slightly less obvious one maybe is this one about the 1905 revolution. So Hitchens' suggestion there is that part of the reason for the brutality and authoritarianism of what followed the Russian Revolution was that by the time the revolution, the successful one in 1917, had happened in the first place, Russia had already been civilizationally ravaged by World War I, that just an ocean of blood had been spilled in this war, and Russia had really gotten much worse of it, right? Than most of the Allied powers, and that they were fighting then essentially the second war, basically on the mountain of skulls that had already been created, and these are conditions in which things could have only gone in a very bloody direction. Whereas he thinks if the 1905 revolution had succeeded, then perhaps the Bolshevik experiment would have developed in a better direction. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a very interesting idea, and it's not one I think we should just rule out a priori, just as obviously false, that no, Stalin and the gulags were the only possible endpoint in 1917. It could not possibly have gone in any other direction, even if it had happened 12 years earlier in 1905 under very different circumstances. And this reminds me a lot of what I've been seeing a lot on left Twitter, where people who are sectarians and ultra-leftists who think, or just very burnt out ex-Bernieites, going on a mood swing, say, oh, this proves that any kind of campaign within the Democratic Party is doomed to failure. Or maybe even more generally, this proves that, electoral reformism in general is doomed to failure. Now, there's a very complicated discussion to be had about the relationship between what, people like Lenin and Trotsky before 1917 would have referred to as the minimum program and the maximum program. That was the standard terminology of socialist parties back then. And what we might think of now is the relationship between social democracy and radical socialism. My perspective is that you need to start with social democracy before you have any chance of building a successful movement for more radical transformation of society. But maybe that perspective is right and maybe it's wrong. But this idea that you can infer from the loss of the Bernie Sanders 2020 campaign some sweeping conclusion about electoralism or the Democratic Party or, anything like that is just asinine. In fact, as ESPN commentator Stephen A. Smith might put it, it's not only asinine, it's also ASA 10 and ASA 11. And to see why, let's think for a second about modal logic. So modal logic, we use these symbols, this one that looks like a diamond for possibility, that one that looks square for necessity. And of course, you can infer from some statement P is true to it's possible that P is true. That's a good inference. That follows. But you absolutely cannot infer from P is true to necessarily P is true. You can't infer, it's an easy mistake to make. Aristotle famously makes it in chapter 9 of his book, De Interpretatione, where he gives this famous example about a sea battle tomorrow. Google it. But it's an easy mistake to make, but it's really important to recognize that it is a mistake to say, this is the way they happened, therefore it's the way they had to happen. The Russian Revolution ended with Stalin and the gulags, therefore it could only have ended with Stalin and the gulags. Bernie Sanders was defeated in the 2020 Democratic primary, therefore he could only have been defeated in the Democratic primary. Total nonsense. Everything that's in the past was once in the future, and the mere fact that things happen some way doesn't necessarily mean that this is the only way they could have happened. We can think of lots of of changes that might have made a difference in that race. Certainly, the fact that the other Democratic candidates consolidated in such a sudden and unexpected way. Nobody who's been doing as well, right, as Mayor Pete was, has ever dropped out before Super Tuesday because another candidate got a big victory in one state, no matter what state it was. And the Democrats could have, the Democratic establishment in 2020 could have easily been as dumb as the Republican establishment was in 2016 when they did not consolidate in that way. And we could also, of course, talk about any number of internal mistakes that that the Sanders campaign, might have made, maybe being too defeatist about South Carolina, that if they put more resources in there for longer to at least narrow Biden's lead, that might have made a difference going forward, made it harder for Obama and other figures who are pushing for that consolidation to succeed. Instead of calling Joe Biden my friend and going soft on him if he'd made an aggressive electability argument against him months earlier. And we'd seen those clips of Biden advocated Social Security cuts months earlier. Maybe that would have made a difference. If the coronavirus outbreak hadn't happened, when it happened, right, then people would be paying more attention to the election. It's possible that some other unexpected event could have come up and there could have been a second change of winds. This is all speculation. But here's the point. Bernie Sanders won the first 3 states. There was a minute there when 538's models were predicting that he would win every single state, like John Kerry in 2004. The entire mainstream media discussion for a long while there was, okay, we all know that Bernie is going to have at least a plurality by the time the convention happens, so should the other candidate, will or should the other candidates, delegates and the superdelegates respect that, or should they try to overturn that plurality on the second ballot? Everybody thought he was going to win across the political spectrum. Right? Said, he lost, therefore he could only have lost, is like if there's a hockey game, right? It's the Red Wings and the Bruins, and Boston is ahead until sometime in the second period when their goaltender starts to mess up, and then Detroit pulls out a big win, anyway. You wouldn't conclude, it must be metaphysically impossible for a team from the Northeast to beat a team from the upper Midwest. That's exactly how silly this is, right? Reasonable people can disagree about whether the sort of strategy that Bernie was attempting is a promising one, whether if he had won the nomination, it would have led to the sort of left-wing breakthrough that that we might hope, or even whether he would have beaten Trump. Right? I think he had a better chance than Biden does. But these are all whether reasonable people can disagree about whether, in fact, electoralism is promising, right? That is a legitimate debate. But it is absolutely not reasonable to conclude a goddamn thing about any of these subjects on the basis of the fact that one candidate in one race who started out winning, then lost. All right, that's it.
Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zer0 Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zer0 Books book club and help us to continue making online content from the left.